Welcome to Midnight Whispers, the place where ordinary people step into extraordinary darkness. Tonight we travel to Alaska, a land where the sky burns green and the ground swallows sound. There's something about the endless nights here, the isolation, the storms, the quiet roads that lead nowhere, that breed stories you can't quite shake off. What you're about to hear are real accounts and bone-deep legends from those who survived them, and from some who didn't. Make sure you subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next time the dark calls. Pull up your hood, take a deep breath, because once we start, the cold takes hold, and it's hard to get warm again. Story 1. Thing in the glacier, the ice core came up wrong, and I should have known right then that we de-drilled into something that was never meant to be found. My name is Dr. Michael Torres, and I am a glaciologist from the University of Colorado. What I am about to tell you will sound impossible, but every word is true. 3 months ago, I was part of a geological survey team studying the Mendenhall Glacier near Juneau, Alaska. We were drilling core samples to study climate change patterns when we discovered something that changed everything I thought I knew about life on Earth. The first sign something was wrong came at 200 feet. Standard ice cores are crystal clear with occasional bubbles of ancient air trapped inside. But this core was different. Dark veins ran through the ice like frozen blood vessels, and when our lights hit them, they seemed to pulse with their own inner glow. My partner, Dr. Sarah Chen, ran the initial tests. The ice dated back roughly 15,000 years. But the dark material showed cellular activity that defied explanation. Under the microscope, it looked biological, but unlike anything in our databases. The cells were perfectly preserved, suspended in some kind of metabolic stasis. The real shock came when we realized the cells were still alive. Not just preserved, but actively responding to temperature changes. When we warmed a sample to just above freezing, the cellular structure began moving, reorganizing itself in patterns that suggested intelligence. The dark veins weren't random formations in the ice. They were part of something larger, something that had been frozen in place for millennia. We called it Specimen X and arranged immediate transport to the lab in Fairbanks. The ice core was packed in specialized freezing units and flown out that same day. I followed on the next available flight, eager to begin comprehensive analysis of what could be the discovery of the century. The lab at the University of Alaska was equipped with everything we needed for biological analysis. Isolation chambers, genetic sequencing equipment, electron microscopes capable of revealing cellular structures at the molecular level. We set up the specimen in a sealed containment unit and began systematic examination. The first week of analysis yielded results that challenged everything we understood about biology. The organism, if we could call it that, showed no DNA structure we could identify. Instead of chromosomes, it had crystalline formations that seemed to store and process information. When exposed to different temperatures, these formations would shift and reorganize, like a biological computer responding to inputs. More disturbing was its reaction to human presence. Whenever someone approached the containment unit, the specimen would orient itself toward them. The dark veins would pulse faster, and the cellular activity would increase dramatically. It was as if the thing was aware of us, studying us just as intently as we were studying it. On day 8, Dr. Chen made a discovery that should have sent us running. The specimen wasn't just one organism. It was a collective, billions of individual cells working together with perfect coordination. And it was learning. Each day, its responses to our tests became more sophisticated, more purposeful. It was adapting to our environment at an alarming rate. The breakthrough came when we analyzed its metabolic processes. The organism didn't consume nutrients in any conventional sense. Instead, it absorbed heat, converting thermal energy directly into cellular activity. As long as it remained frozen, it stayed dormant. But any increase in temperature caused explosive growth and reproduction. It's when we realized what we were really dealing with. This wasn't just an ancient microorganism. It was something that had been deliberately frozen, locked away in the glacier as a containment measure. The ice wasn't its natural habitat. It was its prison. I called for immediate consultation with the CDC, but bureaucratic delays meant we had to wait until the following week for their arrival. In the meantime, the specimen continued to grow stronger and more active. The containment temperature had to be lowered daily to maintain control, and even then, we could see changes occurring in the crystalline structures. On day 12, everything went wrong. A power surge during an October storm caused a temporary failure in the lab, backup systems. The containment unit, its temperature rose by less than 5 degrees. But that was enough. The specimen's growth rate exploded, and within hours, it had consumed all available space in the isolation chamber. When I arrived at the lab the next morning, the containment unit was empty. Not broken open or damaged. Simply empty, as if the specimen had found a way to phase through solid metal and glass. But the real horror was what we found throughout the rest of the building. Every surface in the lab showed traces of the organism. Dark veins spread across the walls like infection, pulsing with that familiar inner light. The pattern was too organized to be random spread. It looked like a neural network, with the empty containment unit as the central hub. Dr. Chen was missing. Her car was still in the parking lot, her personal effects still in her office. But she was nowhere to be found. The security cameras showed her entering the building at 6 a.m., but never leaving. The footage from inside the lab was corrupted, showing only static and occasional glimpses of that dark, pulsing growth. I called the authorities, but what could I tell them? That an ancient organism had escaped from our lab and possibly absorbed my colleague? The official investigation lasted 3 days before being classified as a missing person case. Dr. Chen was presumed to have suffered some kind of breakdown and wandered off into the Alaskan wilderness. But I knew better. I'd seen the organism, its capabilities, its intelligence, its hunger for warmth and growth. And I noticed something else in those final days before the containment failure. The specimen had been forming structures that looked disturbingly like neural tissue. It was building a brain. The fire started on a Tuesday night. The official cause was listed as electrical malfunction, but I know the truth. Someone, or something, wanted to destroy all evidence of what we found. The lab burned completely, taking with it all our research, all our samples, and any proof that Specimen X had ever existed. I was the only witness to survive, and without physical evidence, my reports were dismissed as stress-induced hallucinations. The university quietly reassigned me to a desk job in Denver, far from any glacial research. The official story is that the geological survey found nothing unusual in the Mendenhall ice cores. But I know what's really happening. The organism didn't die in the fire. It adapted, learned to exist at higher temperatures, found new ways to spread and grow. And I think it's been spreading ever since, moving through Alaska, its underground systems, the permafrost, the pipeline infrastructure. Every winter, there are reports of power failures and equipment malfunctions across northern Alaska. Officials blame it on the cold, but I've seen the patterns. The failures are too organized, too purposeful. Something is learning to manipulate our technology, using our own infrastructure to spread further south. Last month, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of Dr. Chen. She was standing in what looked like an ice cave, but her eyes were wrong. Instead of normal pupils, they showed the same dark, pulsing patterns I'd seen in the specimen. And behind her, barely visible in the photograph, the shadows, were others. Dozens of people standing in perfect formation, all with those same transformed eyes. At the bottom of the photograph, someone had written a single word in Chen's handwriting. Come. I think I know where they are. I think the organism has been building something in the depths of the glacier, using human neural tissue to create a collective intelligence far beyond anything we can imagine. And I think it wants me to join them. The nightmare started after I received that photograph. In my dreams, I'm back in the lab, watching the specimen pulse and grow. But now it's speaking to me, not with words but directly into my thoughts. It shows me visions of what Earth could become with its guidance. A world without disease, without aging, without death. All it asks in return is that we surrender our individual consciousness and become part of something greater. Sometimes I wake up and find frost patterns on my bedroom windows that look exactly like the neural networks we observed in the lab. And lately, I've been feeling an almost irresistible urge to book a flight back to Alaska. I think the organism didn't just escape from our lab. I think it infected me during those weeks of close contact, planted microscopic seeds that are finally beginning to grow. The headaches started 2 weeks ago, and sometimes I can feel something moving beneath my skin, following the paths of my circulatory system. I'm writing this as a warning, but also as a confession, because I know now that I'm going back to Alaska. Not because I want to, but because I no longer have a choice. The thing in the glacier is calling its children home, and I am helpless to resist. If you ever see reports of missing researchers in Alaska, or mysterious power failures spreading south through Canada, remember what they told you. The ice is melting, and ancient things that should have stayed buried are waking up. And they hungry. Story 2. Chena Springs Incident. The spirits of Chena Hot Springs dawn to discard their village. They collect visitors who stay too long, and I barely escaped becoming part of their eternal congregation. My name is Tom Bradley, and I am a freelance photographer who specializes in abandoned places across America. Ghost towns, defunct factories, forgotten settlements that time left behind. I've explored hundreds of desolate locations, but nothing prepared me for what I found in the ruins near Chena Hot Springs, Alaska. The assignment came from a travel magazine looking for atmospheric shots of Alaska as hidden history. The old village sat 3 miles northeast of the modern resort, accessible only by an unmarked trail that local guides pretended didn't exist. When I asked about it at the Chena Hot Springs resort, the desk clerk, his face went white as fresh snow. She told me the ruins were off limits, protected by the National Park Service for archaeological preservation. But I already checked the maps. No official designation, no restricted area markings, no government oversight. Just 40 acres of rotting cabins that locals refused to discuss. I hiked out there on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the first snow was beginning to dust the spruce trees. The trail was overgrown but still visible, marked by occasional blazes carved into bark decades ago. The deeper I went into the forest, the quieter everything became. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, no wind through the branches. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, like the forest was swallowing sound. The village appeared suddenly, emerging from the tree line like a mirage made of weathered wood and broken dreams. 12 buildings scattered around a central clearing, each one leaning at angles that suggested the ground beneath them was slowly giving way. The structures looked old, maybe early 1900s construction, built by settlers who come north chasing gold or opportunity and found something else entirely. I set up my camera equipment and started documenting the ruins. Standard abandoned place photography, capturing the way nature reclaims human ambition. But every shot felt wrong somehow. The shadows fell in directions that didn't match the sun's position. The buildings seemed to shift slightly between frames, like they were breathing. The largest structure was a 2-story house at the village center, probably the home of whoever had led this forgotten community. Its windows were intact but so dirty they looked like dead eyes staring at nothing. The front door hung open, revealing darkness that seemed to swallow my camera. This flash. I entered the house just after noon, when the autumn sun was strongest. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but the sound echoed strangely, like the building was much larger inside than outside. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through grimy windows, but they moved against the air currents, forming patterns that looked almost like letters spelling words I couldn't quite read. The interior was preserved in a way that made no sense. Furniture sat exactly where it had been left, covered in dust but not decay. A coffee cup on the kitchen table still held liquid that had somehow not evaporated in decades of abandonment. A newspaper lay folded beside it, dated September 15, 1934, with headlines about economic recovery and local mining operations. Upstairs, I found bedrooms that looked like their occupants had just stepped out for a moment. Beds were neatly made with quilts that should have rotted away long ago. Personal belongings sat on dressers and nightstands, waiting for owners who would never return. In the master bedroom, a family photograph showed 7 people standing in front of the very house I was exploring. Their faces were clear, but their eyes seemed to track my movement across the room. The basement was where everything went wrong. Stone steps led down into darkness that my flashlight couldn't penetrate completely. The air grew colder with each step, and I could hear something that sounded like whispered conversations just below the range of clear hearing. At the bottom of the stairs, my light revealed a room that defied the house's modest footprint. The basement stretched far beyond the building, its foundation, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the village. Ancient support beams held up a ceiling that disappeared into shadow. Along the walls, shelves held hundreds of glass jars filled with something that might have been preserved food or might have been something far worse. In the center of the room stood a wooden table surrounded by 7 chairs, each one occupied by a figure in period clothing. The smell hit me then. Not decay, but something older. Something that suggested these people had been sitting in this basement for decades, waiting for someone to complete their circle. I ran, dropped my expensive camera equipment, and bolted for the stairs like a man fleeing hell itself. Behind me, I heard the scraping of chair legs against stone as the figures rose to follow. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging the basement into absolute darkness. But I could still hear them moving. Slow, deliberate footsteps that matched my panic pace exactly. I made it to ground level and burst through the front door into afternoon sunlight that felt like salvation. But the village had changed during my time underground. The other buildings were no longer empty. Warm light glowed in their windows, and smoke rose from chimneys that had been cold and lifeless an hour earlier. People moved between the structures, going about daily routines in clothing from another century. They all stopped and stared when they saw me. 7 figures, matching the family photograph upstairs exactly, stood in the clearing watching me with expressions of polite interest. The oldest, a bearded man in a wool coat, raised his hand in greeting. His mouth moved like he was speaking, but no sound emerged. Instead, I heard his voice directly inside my head. He welcomed me to their community and invited me to stay for supper. Said they didn't get many visitors and would love to hear news from the outside world. His mental voice was warm, friendly, tinged with the kind of loneliness that comes from decades of isolation. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The other villagers began moving closer, still smiling those patient, understanding smiles. A woman in a floral dress gestured toward one of the smaller cabins, indicating it was prepared for guests. A young man carried a steaming pot from one house to another, and the smell of home cooking filled the air. They wanted me to stay forever. The realization came with absolute clarity. This wasn't the village of ghosts. These were the spirits of people who had died here, still living their daily routines, still maintaining their community, still desperately lonely after 90 years of isolation. They had been waiting for someone to complete their circle, to fill the empty chair in their eternal supper club. I closed my eyes and focused on the modern world beyond the forest. My truck parked at the trailhead, the resort where I was staying, the life I built photographing abandoned places without becoming abandoned myself. When I opened my eyes again, the village was empty and decaying once more. But I could still hear them calling. I hiked back through the forest at a dead run, expecting to feel ghostly hands grabbing at my jacket or hear footsteps following me through the undergrowth. The trail seemed longer than before, twisting through sections of forest I didn't remember from the morning hike. Twice I was certain I was lost, walking in circles while the sun sank toward the horizon. I reached my truck just as full darkness fell over the wilderness. My abandoned camera equipment was sitting neatly in the truck bed, cleaned and organized as if someone had carefully retrieved it from the basement and polished every lens. Attached to my camera was a note written in faded ink. "Thank you for visiting. Please come back soon. We saved you a place at our table." I drove back to the resort and checked out immediately, making the 8-hour drive to Anchorage through the night rather than spending another moment in that area. But leaving Alaska didn't end my connection to the village. 3 months later, I received a package at my home in Colorado. Inside were developed photographs from the film I shot in the village, images I never taken. They showed me sitting at the basement table, surrounded by the 7 villagers, sharing a meal that looked disturbingly appetizing. In each photograph, I was smiling, looking content and at peace. The final image was taken from outside the village, showing all 8 of us standing in the clearing, waving goodbye to whoever was holding the camera. My face in the photograph looked younger, happier, free from the stress and uncertainty that had defined my life since leaving Alaska. I stopped photographing abandoned places, started avoiding rural areas entirely, sticking to cities where the living outnumber the dead by comfortable margins. But sometimes, when I am alone in my apartment, I hear the sound of chair legs scraping against stone. I smell home cooking that reminds me of community and belonging. I remember how peaceful those villagers looked, how content they seemed in their eternal routine. My name is Tom Bradley, and I'm telling you this story because yesterday I found another note slipped under my door. The same faded ink, the same careful handwriting. "Your chair is still empty. Your place is still set. We're waiting for you to come home." The spirits of Chena Hot Springs dawned to just guard their village. They rebuilding it, one lonely soul at a time, creating a community that will last forever. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if that would be such a terrible fate after all. Story 3. Denali Double. I met myself on a frozen trail in Denali National Park, and the thing wearing my face pointed at me like it was marking me for death. My name is Mike Carson, and I've been a park ranger in Alaska for 16 years. I've pulled tourists out of crevasses, tracked injured wildlife through blizzards, and spent countless nights alone in wilderness that could kill you in a dozen different ways. But nothing in my experience prepared me for the morning I encountered my own doppelganger walking toward me through knee-deep snow. It happened during my weekly patrol of the Savage River Loop, a remote section of backcountry that most visitors never see. February in Denali means temperatures that hover around -30, winds that cut through layers of insulation like they read tissue paper, and daylight that barely lasts 6 hours. Perfect conditions for something to go wrong and nobody to witness it. I'd been hiking solo for 3 hours when I saw the figure in the distance. At first, it looked like another ranger making the same patrol route, which would have been unusual but not impossible. We sometimes doubled up on dangerous sections during severe weather warnings. But as the figure got closer, details started falling into place that made my blood freeze in ways the Arctic wind never could. Same height as me, same build, same winter gear in identical colors, same confident stride that comes from years of navigating treacherous terrain. Even from 200 yards away, I could see this person moved exactly like I did, with the same slight favor of the left leg from an old climbing injury. When we were 50 yards apart, I could make out facial features. The figure was wearing my face. Not similar, not close, identical in every detail down to the scar above my left eyebrow from a childhood accident. It was me, walking toward myself across a landscape where meeting another human being should have been impossible. The doppelganger stopped 10 feet away and studied me with eyes that held no recognition, no surprise, no emotion at all. It was like looking into a mirror that showed no reflection of consciousness behind the familiar features. For 30 seconds, we stood in absolute silence while the wind howled around us and snow swirled between our identical forms. Then it raised its right arm and pointed directly at my chest. Not a greeting, not a wave, a deliberate, precise gesture that felt like being targeted by some cosmic force I couldn't begin to understand. The pointing finger held steady for exactly 10 seconds, long enough for me to notice that its winter gloves were identical to mine down to the small tear in the index finger fabric. Without a word, without any change in expression, the doppelganger turned and walked into the white void of an approaching blizzard. I watched it disappear into swirling snow, moving with my own gait, carrying my own posture, becoming invisible in conditions that should have killed anyone without proper shelter within minutes. I radioed back to headquarters immediately. Dispatch confirmed no other rangers were assigned to my sector. No permits had been issued for backcountry camping in that area. Weather conditions made helicopter reconnaissance impossible, and the nearest road access was 40 miles away through terrain that required specialized winter survival equipment. I followed the doppelganger's tracks into the blizzard. The footprints were identical to my own boots. Same size, same tread pattern, same slight wear on the outer edge of the left sole. But they led directly into wilderness that I knew contained no shelter, no trails, no possible route to safety. After half a mile, the tracks simply vanished, not covered by fresh snow but genuinely gone, as if the person making them had been lifted into the air. The blizzard lasted 3 days. When it cleared, search teams combed the entire area looking for signs of the mysterious hiker. We found nothing, no equipment, no body, no indication that anyone had been in that section of the park except for me and my own documented patrol route. But the encounter had changed something fundamental about my relationship with the wilderness. Over the following weeks, I started noticing details that had never bothered me before. My reflection in windows looked slightly wrong, like it was lagging behind my actual movements by fractions of a second. Coworkers mentioned that I seemed different, more distant, though they couldn't explain exactly what had changed. My wife said I talked in my sleep using words she didn't recognize, speaking in a language that sounded like English but with syntax that made no sense. More disturbing were the reports from other park staff. Visitors claimed to have seen me in locations where I definitely wasn't present. A family photographing caribou near Wonder Lake insisted I waved at them from across the valley, but I'd been manning the visitor center 60 miles away. A researcher studying wolf pack behavior reported having a conversation with me about migration patterns, but I never met her and knew nothing about her project. These sightings always followed the same pattern. The other Mike Carson appeared in remote locations, interacted normally with people for a few minutes, then walked away into wilderness areas where survival should have been impossible. When witnesses tried to follow or continue conversations, he simply vanished. I started keeping a detailed log of my whereabouts, trying to establish alibis for times when my doppelganger was reportedly active. The pattern that emerged made me question my own sanity. The other me appeared most frequently during my days off, always in areas I'd been planning to visit but hadn't yet reached. 3 months after the initial encounter, I decided to conduct an experiment. I planned a solo camping trip to Polychrome Pass, a location I mentioned to no one and had never visited during winter. If my doppelganger appeared there before I arrived, it would prove something was actively reading my thoughts or predicting my actions. I hiked to Polychrome Pass on a clear April morning when the snow was beginning to soften and daylight stretched toward 12 hours. The campsite I selected was hidden among rock formations that provided natural windbreaks, invisible from any established trail. My doppelganger was already there, sitting on a boulder and staring directly at the spot where I emerged from the tree line. This time, it was smiling, not a friendly expression, but something that suggested it found my presence amusing in a way that normal human emotion couldn't explain. It wore my face perfectly, but the consciousness behind those familiar features was utterly alien. We stared at each other for several minutes while I tried to process what was happening. The doppelganger, his smile never wavered, never changed intensity, like it was painted on rather than generated by actual facial muscles. When I took a step forward, it stood and walked to the exact spot I planned to pitch my tent. It gestured at the ground with the same pointing motion from our first encounter, indicating the precise location where I intended to make camp. Then it turned and walked toward the edge of Polychrome Pass, a cliff face that dropped 800 feet to jagged rocks below. I watched in horror as my doppelganger walked off the cliff without hesitation, disappearing over the edge like it was stepping through a doorway. I rushed to the precipice expecting to see my own broken body on the rocks below, but found nothing. No impact marks, no signs of anything having fallen, just the empty vastness of the Alaskan wilderness. That night, I camped in the exact spot my doppelganger had indicated. My sleep was filled with dreams of walking through landscapes that looked like Denali but felt wrong in subtle ways. The mountains were too tall, the snow too white, the sky too blue. In these dreams, I met other versions of myself, dozens of them, all wearing different expressions but the same face. When I woke, footprints surrounded my tent, identical to my boots, but made while I was unconscious. They formed a perfect circle around my campsite, as if multiple versions of me had been standing guard while I slept. I submitted my resignation the following week and moved to Arizona, putting as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was masquerading as me in the Alaskan wilderness. But changing geography doesn't solve problems that exist outside normal physical laws. The sightings followed me south. Hikers in the Sonoran Desert reported meeting a park ranger who looked exactly like me, even though I'd taken a job in construction and hadn't worn a uniform in months. The other Mike Carson was still helping lost tourists and sharing wilderness knowledge, still acting like the person I used to be before I met myself on that frozen trail. My wife left me after finding photographs on my phone that I didn't remember taking. Images of myself camping in locations I never visited, smiling at a camera held by someone who cast no shadow. In the final picture, I was pointing directly at whoever was taking the photograph, using the same gesture my doppelganger had made during our first encounter. I don't sleep well anymore. Every reflection might be the other me looking back, and every mirror could be a window into a world where someone else is living my life better than I ever did. Sometimes I wonder if if the real Mike Carson walked off that cliff in Polychrome Pass and left me to figure out how to exist as an echo of someone else's identity. My name is Mike Carson, and I am telling you this story because yesterday I received a postcard from Denali National Park. No message, just a photograph of the Savage River Loop where I met my doppelganger. In the picture, two figures are walking toward each other through the snow. One is pointing at the other, and both are wearing my face. The thing that terrifies me most is that I can remember which one I was. Story 4. Radio signal from the dead station. The dead man. His voice was still calling for help when I found his frozen body. I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened in Alaska. Radio waves don't stop when someone dies. They bounce around the Earth's atmosphere for years, decades even, carrying messages from places that no longer exist and people who are no longer breathing. But this was different. This signal was fresh, continuous, and impossible. My name is Marcus Reed. I am a communications technician for the National Weather Service, and 3 months ago, I was sent to investigate Station Echo 7, a remote monitoring post in the Alaskan wilderness that had been transmitting the same Morse code message for 6 straight weeks. SOS. HEL page. AREIN. WALLS. The station's operator, Thomas Keller, had been found dead of a heart attack 2 months prior. His replacement hadn't arrived yet, and the automated systems should have stopped broadcasting anything beyond weather data. Yet somehow, this plea for help kept repeating every 12 minutes, 24 hours a day. The flight to Fairbanks felt normal enough. It was February, and Alaska was locked in that particular kind of winter darkness that makes you question whether the sun actually exists. My connecting flight to the bush plane was delayed by weather, giving me time to review Keller's file. 58 years old, 23 years of service, no family, no history of mental illness. He requested the isolated posting specifically, wanting to get away from civilization after his wife died. The bush pilot, a grizzled man named Carl who looked like he'd been flying these routes since Alaska was still Russian territory, dropped me at a small airstrip carved into the forest. Station Echo 7 was another 8 miles through the snow by snowmobile. The silence hit me first. After the plane's engines faded, there was nothing but the whisper of wind through pine trees and the crunch of my boots in 2 feet of fresh powder. The temperature gauge on my pack read -37 Fahrenheit. Cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. The snowmobile started on the 3rd pull, and I began the journey deeper into the wilderness. The trail wound between towering spruces and across frozen streams, following old survey markers that hadn't been updated since the 1970s. No cell service, no GPS backup, just a compass and the knowledge that civilization was already too far behind me to walk back. Station Echo 7 sat in a clearing like something from another era. The main building was a squat concrete structure designed to withstand everything Alaska could throw at it: blizzards, earthquakes, temperatures that could crack steel. A radio tower stretched 90 feet into the gray sky, its red warning lights blinking steadily. A smaller cabin, probably Keller's living quarters, sat 50 yards away, connected by a covered walkway. The generator was still running, which surprised me. Keller had been dead for 2 months. Someone should have shut it down by now, but apparently, standard protocol had broken down somewhere in the bureaucracy. The fuel tank showed 3/4 full, meaning the automated refill system was also still functioning. I unloaded my gear and approached the main station. The heavy steel door was unlocked, which violated about 15 different security protocols. Inside, banks of monitoring equipment hummed quietly, their screens showing weather data from across northern Alaska. Everything looked normal, professional, routine, except for the radio console. The Morse code transmitter was active, its indicator light pulsing in rhythm with the message. ... Pause. Then the letters spelling out that impossible plea for help. The signal was broadcasting on an emergency frequency, strong enough to reach Anchorage and beyond. I checked the transmission log. The message had begun exactly 47 days ago at 3:17 a.m. That was 6 days after Keller's estimated time of death. My hands shook as I typed commands into the computer system, but not from the cold. The automatic weather broadcast was functioning normally on a different frequency. Wind speed, temperature, barometric pressure, all updating every 15 minutes like clockwork. But this other signal, this cry for help, was coming from somewhere else entirely. I needed to see where Keller died. The walkway to the cabin was enclosed but unheated, and my breath formed ice crystals that fell tinkling to the floor. The cabin door was also unlocked. Inside, everything was preserved by the cold like an exhibit in a museum. Coffee cup on the table, half full and frozen solid. Reading glasses on an open paperback novel. A man. His life interrupted mid-sentence. Keller's body was gone, of course, flown out 2 months ago for autopsy. But the scene remained undisturbed. A chair tipped over near the kitchenette, scattered papers that suggested he'd been working on something when his heart gave out. The investigators had ruled it natural causes, stress-induced cardiac arrest. 40 below zero in complete isolation could do that to a person. I was photographing the scene when I heard it. Through the cabin walls, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of Morse code. Not from the radio in the main station, but from somewhere much closer. Tap, 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 pause. Tap, tap, tap. The same rhythm, the same message. Help, they are in the walls. The sound was coming from inside the cabin walls. I pressed my ear to the wood paneling. The tapping continued, soft but persistent, like someone using a small hammer or their knuckles. Moving along the wall, I followed the sound toward the back of the cabin. It seemed to be coming from behind the bedroom, in a section where there shouldn't be any space for someone to hide. My flashlight revealed nothing unusual about the wall, its exterior. Standard log construction, properly chinked against the cold. But when I returned to the bedroom and examined the interior wall more carefully, I found something the investigators had missed. A section of paneling, roughly 3 feet square, had been removed and replaced. The screws were newer than the surrounding hardware, and the wood stain didn't quite match. Someone had cut an access hole into the wall and then sealed it back up. The tapping continued, patient and methodical. SOS, HELP, AREIN, WALLS. I found a screwdriver in Keller's toolbox and began removing the screws. They came out easily, too easily, as if they'd been loosened and tightened many times. The panel lifted away, revealing a hollow space between the inner and outer walls. The smell hit me immediately. Decay, but not the normal decomposition you'd expect from a dead animal. This was something else, something older and more complex, like wet earth and metal and something sweetly organic that made my stomach turn. My flashlight beam penetrated the darkness, and I saw cables. Dozens of them, running in neat parallel lines through the wall space. But these weren't electrical cables or phone lines. They were biological, organic tubes, roughly the thickness of my thumb, pale and translucent. And they were moving. The cables pulsed rhythmically, like arteries carrying blood. Following them with the flashlight, I could see they emerged from somewhere deeper in the wall and ran toward the main station. Each pulse coincided exactly with the Morse code transmission. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to get back on the snowmobile and drive straight to the airstrip. But I needed to understand what I was seeing. These things, whatever they were somehow connected to the radio equipment. They were generating the signal. Back in the main station, I traced the cables, path through the building, its infrastructure. They emerged from the wall near the radio console and connected to the transmitter through what looked like standard coaxial inputs. But when I touched one of the connections, it felt warm and slightly soft, like living tissue. The signal strength was increasing. Whatever was generating the Morse code was getting stronger, more urgent. The message had changed too. Now it repeated, COME, DOWN, HEIS, WATING. Come down. But down where? I searched the station building more systematically, looking for any access to a basement or sublevel. The concrete foundation appeared solid, but in the utility room, I found a steel grate set into the floor. It was meant to provide access to the building, its heating and electrical systems. But when I lifted it, my flashlight revealed more than just utility lines. The space below was larger than it should have been, extending beyond the building, its footprint. And it was full of the same organic cables I found in the walls. They hung like jungle vines, pulsing with that rhythmic heartbeat, all converging on something deeper in the darkness. The ladder down was standard aluminum, but the rungs were slick with some kind of moisture that felt oily and wrong. I descended anyway, driven by a combination of professional duty and morbid curiosity that I now recognize as the worst decision of my life. The underground chamber was enormous, carved from the permafrost and lined with those living cables. They covered every surface like a circulatory system, all pulsing in perfect synchronization. And at the center, connected to the densest concentration of organic conduits, was Thomas Keller. He was still alive. His body was suspended in the network of cables, partially absorbed into the biological mass. His chest rose and fell slowly, and his eyes tracked my movement as I approached. But when his mouth opened, no words came out. Instead, the Morse code signal grew stronger, more insistent. The cables were using his nervous system to generate the transmissions. The truth hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a radio station. It was something else entirely, something that had been masquerading as a government weather monitoring post. The real station Echo 7 had probably been compromised years ago, maybe decades. And Keller had died of a heart attack. He'd been integrated into whatever this thing was, turned into a component in its communication system. The organic network pulsed faster now, responding to my presence. New cables emerged from the walls, reaching toward me with obvious intention. I understood finally what the message meant. They are in the walls. Not hiding in the walls, but part of them. A biological system that had been slowly taking over the station, learning to mimic human technology while serving some other purpose entirely. I ran up the ladder, through the main station, out into the Alaskan cold that suddenly felt like salvation instead of threat. Behind me, the radio tower, its lights began flashing faster, and I could hear the hum of transmission equipment operating at maximum power. The thing was broadcasting something new now, something stronger than Morse code. The snowmobile wouldn't start. 3 poles, 5, 10, nothing. The fuel line had been cut, cleanly severed as if by surgical instruments. In the distance, the radio tower, its hum was growing louder, almost musical. And from the station building came new sounds. Scraping, sliding, the whisper of organic movement. I started walking, 8 miles through knee-deep snow and temperatures that could kill, but staying meant something worse than death. Behind me, the radio signals grew stronger, more complex. Not just Morse code now, but digital transmissions, satellite uplinks, cellular signals. The biological network was connecting to every communication system it could reach, spreading its influence beyond the isolated station. The rescue team found me 3 days later, semi-conscious from hypothermia but alive. When they asked about Station Echo 7, I told them the equipment had malfunctioned and I'd been forced to abandon my post. They accepted the explanation without question. Government bureaucracy, they said. These things happen. The official report lists Station Echo 7 as offline due to technical difficulties. The site has been marked for renovation sometime next fiscal year, which means it will probably sit abandoned for another decade. The radio signal stopped the day I left, and the incident was quietly filed away. But I monitor those frequencies every night from my home in Anchorage. And sometimes, in the deep hours when atmospheric conditions are just right, I can hear them. New signals from new locations. Weather stations, cell towers, satellite relays. The network is spreading, one communication hub at a time. We're not just in the walls anymore. They are the walls. Story 5. Screaming skulls of St. Lawrence Island. I still wake up every night to the sound of screaming. Not human screaming, something older, something that shouldn't have a voice. 3 months ago, I was leading an archaeological expedition to St. Lawrence Island, a windswept chunk of permafrost sitting in the middle of the Bering Sea. The kind of place where civilization feels like a distant memory and the horizon stretches empty in every direction. We were there to investigate reports of an ancient Yupik burial ground, uncovered by the melting permafrost. Climate change was revealing secrets that had been frozen for over 1,000 years. My name is Dr. Marcus Webb. I spent 15 years digging up the past, thinking I understood how the dead should behave. I was wrong about everything. The island greeted us with 40-mile-per-hour winds and temperatures that cut through our Arctic gear like we were wearing t-shirts. Our team consisted of 6 researchers, 2 graduate students, and me. We set up camp near the excavation site, a depression in the tundra where local hunters had first spotted bone fragments poking through the melting ground. The first day, everything seemed normal. We established our grid system, began cataloging surface finds, and started the careful process of exposing what lay beneath. The permafrost had preserved everything perfectly. Too perfectly. When we brushed away the first layer of frozen soil, we found them. 37 skulls, arranged in a perfect spiral pattern, eye sockets all facing inward toward the center. The forensic anthropologist on our team, Dr. Sarah Chen, had never seen anything like it. Ancient burial practices among the Yupik people were well documented, but this arrangement defied everything we knew about their customs. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The wind howling across the tundra sounded different here, almost like voices. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. Remote fieldwork does that to people. But when I finally dozed off around 3 in the morning, I dreamed of those empty eye sockets, all staring at something I couldn't see. I woke up to Sarah screaming. Outside our tent, she was standing in the middle of our excavation site, pointing at the ground with a shaking finger. The skulls had moved. During the night, somehow, they had rearranged themselves. Instead of the spiral we had carefully documented and photographed, they now formed a straight line pointing directly at our campsite. We checked our security cameras. Nothing. 8 hours of footage showed the dig site covered in darkness, undisturbed. Yet the evidence was undeniable. 37 ancient skulls had somehow repositioned themselves while we slept. Dr. Chen insisted there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe the permafrost was shifting as it thawed. Maybe we had misremembered the original pattern. Maybe local wildlife had disturbed the site. But when we examined each skull more closely, we found something that made her theories crumble. Fresh tool marks, scratches and gouges in the bone that looked like they had been made within the last few hours. The bone was over 1,000 years old, but these marks were new. Something had been handling these skulls in the darkness. That afternoon, we excavated deeper into the mass grave. What we found beneath the skulls made the moving bone arrangement seem trivial by comparison. Bodies, dozens of them, but not arranged like any burial we had ever documented. They were piled on top of each other in a chaotic heap, limbs intertwined, some still bearing fragments of ancient clothing. Most disturbing of all, many of the skeletons showed signs of extreme trauma. Broken bones, fractured ribs, skulls with massive impact wounds. This wasn't a burial ground. It was a massacre site. The local Yupik elder who had guided us to the island, a weathered man named Thomas Kanguk, refused to come near the excavation once we started uncovering the bodies. He would only say that this place had been forbidden to his people for generations, that the screaming spirits of the murdered dead lived in the bones and should never be disturbed. I should have listened to him. On the third night, the screaming started. It began around midnight as a low moan carried on the wind. At first, we dismissed it as another strange acoustic effect of the barren landscape. But the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind. It was voices, dozens of them, wailing in harmonious agony. I grabbed a flashlight and stumbled out of my tent. The other team members were already outside, staring at the excavation site in horror. The skulls were moving, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the slow, deliberate motion of something very much alive. They rolled and shifted in the frozen earth, grinding against each other with a sound like chalk on a blackboard. And they were screaming. Each skull emitted its own distinct cry of anguish, 37 voices joining together in a chorus of the damned. The sound penetrated straight through my chest, vibrating in my bones, making my teeth ache. Several team members collapsed to their knees, covering their ears and retching. The screaming continued for exactly 17 minutes. When it stopped, the silence felt even more terrifying than the noise. In the morning, we found the skulls arranged in a new pattern. This time, they formed letters in the ancient Yupik syllabary, spelling out words none of us could read. Thomas Kanguk took one look at the message and refused to translate it. He packed his gear immediately and demanded we evacuate the island. We should have left with him. Instead, we stayed and continued our excavation. Academic curiosity had overcome common sense. We told ourselves we were witnessing an unprecedented archaeological phenomenon that needed to be documented and studied. We rationalized the impossible and convinced ourselves we were in control. By the fifth day, we had uncovered over 200 bodies. The massacre site was far larger than we had initially suspected. Carbon dating suggested the deaths had occurred around 900 AD, but the cause remained a mystery. No evidence of warfare with neighboring tribes. No signs of disease. Just sudden, brutal violence on a massive scale. That night, the skulls didn't just scream. They spoke in perfect, modern English. They called us by name. They knew details about our personal lives, our families, our fears. Sarah, the skull, whispered about her divorce proceedings back in Seattle. Mine spoke about my estranged relationship with my teenage daughter. They knew things no ancient Yupik spirit should know. One skull, larger than the others with a distinctive crack running down the frontal bone, seemed to serve as their spokesperson. It rolled to the edge of our excavation pit and spoke directly to me in a voice that sounded disturbingly like my own father. It told me the truth about what had happened on St. Lawrence Island. The massacre hadn't been committed by human hands. The Yupik people who died here had been victims of something else. Something that had emerged from the frozen ground during an unusually warm summer, just like this one. Something that fed on human consciousness and left only empty shells behind. The skull explained that the thing had been sleeping in the permafrost for thousands of years, waiting for the ice to melt enough to free it. The Yupik people had discovered it first, and it had consumed their minds, their memories, their very souls. What remained were the screaming echoes of their consciousness, trapped forever in their bones. And now it was awake again. The next morning, I found Dr. Chen standing motionless at the edge of the excavation site. Her eyes were open but completely vacant, staring into the mass grave with no recognition or awareness. When I called her name, she didn't respond. When I touched her shoulder, she felt cold as the permafrost. She was still breathing, but Sarah was gone. One by one, my team members began disappearing from the inside out. Their bodies remained, performing basic functions like eating and walking, but the people they had been were simply erased. Empty shells with no consciousness behind their eyes. I realized with growing horror that I could feel it too, a creeping numbness spreading through my thoughts, making it harder to concentrate, to remember why I was here, to care about anything at all. The thing in the permafrost was feeding on us slowly, savoring our consciousness like a fine meal. I managed to escape on the 7th day, stealing our emergency satellite phone and calling for an immediate evacuation. The rescue helicopter found me alone on the beach, the rest of my team standing silently around the excavation site like mannequins waiting for instructions. The official report blamed the incident on extreme psychological stress caused by isolation and the discovery of the massacre site. The team members I left behind were diagnosed with a rare form of catatonic disorder and transferred to psychiatric facilities in Anchorage. None of them have spoken a word since. But I know the truth. The thing is still there, still feeding. And as the permafrost continues to melt, it is getting stronger. Sometimes, late at night, I can hear the screaming skulls calling to me from across 3,000 miles of distance. They want me to come back. They want me to finish what we started, because I didn't. To just escape from St. Lawrence Island. I brought part of it with me. The numbness is spreading again, and I can feel my memories starting to fade. My thoughts are becoming less my own with each passing day. I am writing this while I still can, while I still remember who I am. If you, re-listening to this, if someone finds this recording after I'm gone, don't let them go back to that island. Don't let them disturb what should stay buried in the ice. Some secrets should remain frozen forever. The screaming is getting louder now, and I think I'm beginning to understand what those skulls were trying to tell us in their ancient language. They were warning us to run. The dark feels closer now, doesn't it? If you're still with me, hit subscribe and tap the bell. It's how we keep our small fire burning. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Alaska's shadows reach far. Story 6. Wendigo of the Wrangell Mountains. I stopped returning phone calls 3 months ago. My friends think I've lost my mind. Maybe I have, but I know what I saw in those mountains, and I know what followed me home. It started with a simple hiking trip to the Wrangell Mountains in Alaska. My buddy Jake and I had planned this for years. 2 middle-aged guys from Phoenix, desperate to escape our desk jobs and pretend we were still young. The kind of adventure that feels necessary when you hit 40 and realize your biggest thrill is finding a parking spot at Costco. We flew into Anchorage on a Tuesday morning in late September. The rental cars smelled like stale cigarettes and pine air freshener. Jake was excited, talking nonstop about the wildlife we might see, the photos he'd take. I should have paid more attention to the silence that followed us out of the city. The Wrangell Mountains rise like broken teeth from the Alaskan wilderness. 16 million acres of untouched land where cell towers dawn, T-reach and GPS signals die. The kind of place that makes you remember humans aren't really in charge of it. We drove for 6 hours on increasingly narrow roads. The last 50 miles were gravel, our rental car bouncing through potholes deep enough to swallow a tire. The autumn colors were breathtaking. Reds and golds stretched endlessly under an impossibly wide sky. But something felt wrong. No birds, no sounds except our engine and the crunch of gravel under our wheels. The trailhead was marked by a weathered wooden sign and nothing else. No ranger station, no other cars, just us and the wilderness. Jake pulled out his camera immediately, snapping pictures of the sign, the mountains, me looking uncomfortable in my new hiking boots. That's when we met Joseph. He appeared from the tree line like he'd been waiting for us. An older native man with silver hair braided down his back and eyes the color of winter. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt, but moved through the forest with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged there. Joseph didn't introduce himself at first. He just watched us unpack our gear with an expression I couldn't read. When Jake offered him a granola bar, Joseph finally spoke. His voice was soft but carried weight. He told us his grandfather, stories about these mountains, about the hunger that lived in the high places, about things that wore familiar faces and spoke with trusted voices, things that were always searching for their next meal. Jake laughed it off, called it local folklore designed to scare tourists. But I noticed Joseph wasn't smiling. He looked directly at me and said something I'll never forget. The Wendigo knows when you're alone, even when you're not. We thanked him for the warning and started up the trail. I looked back once and saw Joseph still standing by our car, watching us disappear into the forest. His hands were pressed together like he was praying. The first day of hiking was perfect. Cool air, stunning views, and the kind of silence that makes you remember what peace feels like. We made good time, covering 12 miles before setting up camp beside a crystalline stream. Jake cooked freeze-dried pasta while I gathered firewood. Normal camping stuff, nothing strange yet. But that night, as we sat around our small fire, I heard something that made my stomach clench. It was Jake's voice, calling my name from somewhere in the darkness beyond our campsite. The problem was Jake was sitting right next to me. He heard it too. His face went white in the firelight. We both listened as my name echoed through the trees again and again, each time from a different direction. Always in Jake's voice. Always with that same casual tone he used when he wanted to show me something interesting. The calls continued for 20 minutes before stopping abruptly. We didn't sleep much that night. The second day brought fog that rolled through the mountains like smoke. Visibility dropped to maybe 30 feet in any direction. The trail became harder to follow. Landmarks disappeared. Even with GPS and map, we found ourselves second-guessing every turn. That's when Jake started acting strange. He began walking ahead of me, always just at the edge of visibility in the fog. When I called out to him, he didn't respond, but his voice sounded different. Flatter somehow, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. Around noon, the fog lifted suddenly. I found myself alone on the trail. Jake was nowhere in sight. I called his name until my throat was raw. Nothing. No response. No sign he'd ever been there except for footprints in the mud that seemed too large, too deep for someone Jake's size. I followed the prints for 3 hours. They led me off the main trail and deeper into the wilderness. The prints grew stranger as I followed them. Sometimes they looked normal. Other times they stretched impossibly long, as if whatever made them had been running on legs that bent in ways human legs shouldn't bend. As evening approached, I heard Jake's voice again. This time it was coming from ahead of me, just around a bend in the trail. He was calling my name with increasing urgency, saying he was hurt, saying he needed help. The voice was perfect. Every inflection, every tone exactly right. But I remembered what Joseph had told us about things that wore familiar faces and spoke with trusted voices. I hid behind a massive pine tree and waited. What came around the bend wasn't Jake. It stood maybe 8 feet tall, thin as a scarecrow but wrong in ways that hurt to look at. Its skin was gray-white, stretched tight over bones that jutted at sharp angles. Its arms hung too long, ending in fingers like broken twigs. But the worst part was its face. It looked almost human, almost familiar, like Jake's features had been stretched and twisted by hungry hands. The thing's mouth moved constantly, making soft sounds I couldn't quite hear. Testing voices like a radio searching for a clear station. When it spoke again, the voice was mine. Jake, where are you? I'm scared, man. I think something is following us. Perfect mimicry of words I'd spoken hours earlier when the fog was thick and I couldn't see where I was going. The thing had been listening, learning, practicing. It stood in the middle of the trail for what felt like hours, cycling through different voices. Jake's laugh, my nervous cough. Joseph's soft warning about the hunger that lived in the high places. Each sound was exact, but when they came from that twisted mouth, they felt like violations. Eventually it moved on, disappearing into the trees with movements that seemed to ignore physics. Joints bending backward, steps that covered too much ground too quickly. I waited until full dark before moving. My plan was simple. Get back to the car, drive to Anchorage, and pretend this never happened. But the trail in the dark was a different beast entirely. Every shadow could be hiding something. Every sound made me freeze and listen for footsteps that bent the wrong way. The thing, his voice followed me, always from just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Sometimes it was Jake calling for help. Sometimes it was my own voice, begging Jake to wait up. But worse were the times it used voices I didn't recognize. A woman crying for her children. An old man asking directions to a town that didn't exist. A child singing nursery rhymes in a language I'd never heard but somehow understood was about being hungry. Always hungry. I realized the thing had been collecting voices for a long time. The walk back to the trailhead took all night. I reached our rental car as the sun was rising, exhausted and shaking. Jake wasn't there. His gear was still in the trunk, untouched. I waited until noon, hoping he could somehow find his way back. But deep down I knew better. Whatever had taken Jake, his appearance had probably taken Jake too. I drove back to Anchorage with the radio turned up loud, trying to drown out the sound of familiar voices calling from the empty passenger seat. The police were polite but skeptical. Search and rescue teams found no trace of Jake beyond the campsite from our first night. His disappearance was classified as an accident. People get lost in Alaska all the time, they said. The wilderness is unforgiving. I flew home to Phoenix and tried to resume normal life. But the thing had followed me. It started with phone calls at 3 a.m. Jake, his voice asking why I left him behind. My own voice reading aloud from news articles about missing hikers in Alaska. Sometimes it was Joseph, his voice, repeating warnings about the hunger that lived in the high places. Then I started seeing it, always at the edge of my vision, in the parking lot outside my office, standing behind other customers at the grocery store, tall and wrong and wearing faces that were almost right but not quite. It never approached directly, never spoke when others could hear, but it was always there, watching and waiting and learning new voices from everyone around me. Last week I heard my ex-wife, this voice outside my apartment at midnight, asking me to let her in because she was scared. We'd been divorced for 5 years. She lives in Seattle now, but the voice was perfect down to the slight lisp she gets when she's been crying. I looked through the peephole and saw something tall and gray standing in the hallway, its mouth moving in shapes that didn't match the words I was hearing. That's when I knew I had to tell someone. Had to warn people about what lives in those mountains and what it does to travelers who wander too far from the marked trails. Joseph was right about one thing. The Wendigo knows when you're alone, even when you're not. Even when you're surrounded by 8 million people in a city built in the desert, it can find you. It can learn your voice and the voices of everyone you ever loved. And now it knows mine. If you planning a trip to Alaska, stay on the marked trails. Don, to trust voices calling from the darkness, even if they sound like your best friend. Especially if they sound like your best friend, because some hungers are patient. Some hungers can wait decades for the perfect moment to feed. And some hungers never forget the taste of what got away. I'm telling you this story because I think it has found others like me. People who saw what they shouldn't have seen. People who got away when they shouldn't have gotten away. If you start hearing familiar voices in places where they shouldn't be, remember what happened to Jake. Remember what happened to me. And whatever you do, Don, to answer when they call your name. Story 7. Frozen figures of the McCarthy massacre. I never believed in evil until I saw what the cold could preserve. My name is David Chen, and I am a forensic photographer for the Alaska State Troopers. 23 years on the job, and I thought I'd seen everything the last frontier could throw at me. Car accidents on the Dalton Highway where bodies froze solid before the ambulance arrived. Hunters who got lost in the wilderness and weren't found until spring thaw revealed their remains. But nothing prepared me for what I discovered in McCarthy in March 2006. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. A group of extreme skiers had stumbled across something unusual while exploring the abandoned Kennecott copper mine area near McCarthy. The town itself is barely a dot on the map, population maybe 25 in winter, nestled in the Wrangell Mountains about 300 miles east of Anchorage. It's the kind of place where civilization ends and the wilderness begins. I flew in with Detective Sarah Morrison on a small charter plane that bounced through mountain thermals like a pinball. The pilot, a grizzled bush flyer named Jack, kept muttering about the weather. Storm coming in tonight, he said, glancing at the gray clouds building over the peaks. Might be stuck here a few days. The skiers met us at the tiny airstrip. College kids from outside, as we call anyone not from Alaska. They looked shaken. The leader, a kid named Tyler with expensive gear and the kind of confidence that money buys, led us to their discovery. We hiked for 2 hours through knee-deep snow, following a trail that wound between towering spruce trees and across frozen streams. The silence was absolute except for the crunch of our snowshoes and the whistle of wind through the branches. Then Tyler stopped at the edge of a clearing. There, he pointed. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Just another patch of wilderness, maybe an old mining camp from the copper boom days. But as my eyes adjusted, I started to make out shapes in the snow. Regular shapes. Too regular. Detective Morrison was already pulling out her camera. Jesus Christ, she whispered. There were 7 of them. 7 human figures, perfectly preserved in the ice and snow, arranged in a semicircle around what looked like the remains of a campfire. They sat upright, as if they'd been having a conversation when death found them. But it was how they died that made my hands shake as I started taking photographs. Each figure had been shot once in the back of the head. Execution style. The cold had preserved everything with horrifying clarity. I could see the entry wounds, the expressions of surprise still frozen on their faces, even the steam from their last breath crystallized in the air around their mouths. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was their clothing. These people were dressed like it was 1983. Vintage parkas, old-style snow boots, everything exactly as it would have been over 20 years ago. And scattered around the campsite were newspapers and magazines from that same year. "Tyler," Detective Morrison called out. "You said you found this yesterday?" That's right. We were looking for fresh powder off the main trails when Jake spotted something weird in the trees." Tyler gestured to one of his friends, a pale kid who hadn't said a word since we arrived. "We got closer and saw what looked like people sitting around a campfire. Thought maybe they needed help. Then we realized they weren't moving." I kept taking pictures, documenting everything. The crime scene was pristine, untouched by scavengers or weather. In most places, exposed bodies would have been torn apart by bears or wolves within days. But here, 300 miles from the nearest city, in temperatures that hadn't risen above zero in months, nature had turned into the perfect morgue. As I worked, pieces of a puzzle began forming in my mind. I heard stories about McCarthy, whispered tales that old-timers shared in Anchorage bars after too many drinks. Stories about the winter of 1983, when a drifter had shown up in town and things had gone very, very wrong. The official reports from that time were sparse. A man named Robert Yates had arrived in McCarthy in late November 1983, claiming to be a prospector looking for work. He rented a cabin on the outskirts of town and kept to himself mostly, except for occasional trips to the general store for supplies. The locals were used to loners and eccentrics, so nobody paid him much attention at first. But by January, people started disappearing. It began with Tom Bradley, a mining engineer who stayed in town for the winter to maintain equipment. He went out to check on some machinery and never came back. Then Sarah Mitchell, a nurse who ran the tiny medical clinic, vanished on her way home from treating a sick child. One by one, McCarthy's winter population began to shrink. The remaining residents tried to organize search parties, but the weather was brutal that year. Temperatures dropped to 40 below, and blizzards rolled through the valley for days at a time. Anyone who went out looking for the missing people risked becoming missing themselves. By March, only a handful of people were left in town. That is when Robert Yates made his move. According to the single surviving witness, an old Athabascan trapper named Joseph Pete, Yates gathered the remaining residents together under the pretense of organizing a final search effort. He told them he found signs of the missing people in the woods and convinced them to follow him into the wilderness. Joseph Pete had been suspicious from the beginning. Something about Yates didn't sit right with him, the way his eyes never seemed to focus on what he was looking at, like he was always seeing something else. So when the group set off into the forest, Joseph hung back and followed at a distance. What he witnessed still gave him nightmares 23 years later. Yates led the 7 remaining residents to a clearing about 2 miles from town. He prepared everything in advance. A fire pit, logs arranged in a semicircle for seating, even a pot of coffee boiling over the flames. It looked like a friendly winter gathering, the kind of community bonding that helped people survive the harsh Alaska winters. But when everyone was seated and relaxed, Yates pulled out a hunting rifle and began executing them one by one. Joseph Pete watched in horror from behind a snow-covered spruce tree as his neighbors and friends were murdered in cold blood. The killer worked methodically, starting with the men who might have posed a physical threat, then moving on to the women and finally the elderly postmaster who had been too sick to run. When it was over, Yates sat down among the bodies and waited. Joseph Pete stayed hidden for hours, watching through the falling snow as the killer just sat there, staring at his victims like he was expecting something to happen. Finally, as darkness fell, Yates stood up and walked deeper into the forest. Joseph Pete never saw him again. The trapper waited until morning, then made his way back to town and tried to contact the authorities. But the radio was dead, the phones were down, and the next plane wasn't scheduled to arrive for 2 weeks. By the time help finally came, the crime scene was buried under 6 feet of fresh snow. Search teams found no trace of the bodies or Robert Yates. The killer had simply vanished into the Alaska wilderness like so many before him. The official report listed 7 people as missing, presumed dead, victims of the harsh winter and a probable serial killer who was never found. But now, standing in that frozen clearing with my camera, I was looking at proof that the old stories were true. 7 bodies, perfectly preserved, exactly as Joseph Pete had described them. The cold had been their tombstone and their monument, keeping them frozen in their final moments for over 2 decades. Detective Morrison was on her satellite phone, calling for backup and a forensics team. But I knew it would be hours before anyone could reach us, and the weather was getting worse by the minute. The wind had picked up, and snow was beginning to fall in thick, heavy flakes. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were 8 logs arranged around the fire pit, 8 seats for what should have been a group of 7 people. I counted the bodies again, thinking I made a mistake in the shock of discovery. But there were definitely only 7 victims. Someone else had been expected at that final gathering. Someone who never showed up. Or someone who had been the killer. I was examining the empty seat when Tyler called out from the edge of the clearing. "Hey, there's something else over here." He found a trail leading away from the campsite, partially hidden by overhanging branches. The snow was deeper here, untouched by wind, and I could make out what looked like old footprints. They were faint, barely visible depressions in the white, but they were definitely there. The trail led into the dense forest, winding between massive trees that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. Detective Morrison wanted to wait for backup, but I convinced her we should at least see where the trail went. We had maybe an hour of light left, and the storm was moving in fast. We followed the footprints for about half a mile before they led us to something that shouldn't have existed. Hidden in a grove of ancient spruces was a cabin. Not a ruin, not the remains of an old structure, but an actual functioning cabin with smoke rising from the chimney and warm light glowing in the windows. The college kids hung back, suddenly very aware that they were a long way from civilization with no way to call for help. Detective Morrison drew her service weapon and motioned for everyone to stay quiet. We approached the cabin slowly, feet crunching in the snow despite our efforts to be silent. Through the windows, I could see the interior was furnished like something from decades past. Wood-burning stove, kerosene lamps, furniture that looked handmade, and sitting at a rough wooden table, his back to the window, was a figure in a heavy winter coat. The figure wasn't moving. Detective Morrison tried the door. It wasn't locked. The hinges creaked as we pushed it open, and the smell hit us immediately. Not the smell of death or decay, but something else. Something like ozone after a lightning strike, sharp and electric. The man at the table was Robert Yates. Had to be. The age was right, and his clothes matched the description from the old police reports. He sat perfectly still, hands folded in front of him, staring at the wall. When we walked around to face him, I understood why he wasn't moving. He was frozen solid, not just dead, but literally turned to ice. His eyes were open, pupils dilated, looking at something none of us could see. Frost covered his beard and eyebrows, and when Detective Morrison cautiously touched his shoulder, her glove stuck to the frozen fabric. But here is what made no sense. The cabin was warm. The fire was burning. The temperature inside had to be at least 70 degrees. In normal circumstances, a frozen body would have thawed hours ago. Yet Robert Yates sat there like an ice sculpture, perfectly preserved in the warmth. On the table in front of him were spread dozens of photographs. Old Polaroids, the kind with the white borders that were popular in the 80s. I recognized some of the faces immediately. They were pictures of his victims, taken at the moment of death. Their expressions of shock and terror were captured forever in fading color film. But mixed in with the death photos were other pictures. Images of the victims from before they died, going about their daily lives in McCarthy. Tom Bradley fixing a piece of mining equipment. Sarah Mitchell treating a patient. The postmaster sorting mail. It was like Yates had been stalking them for weeks or months before the final massacre. At the bottom of the pile was a photograph that made my hands shake. It showed the clearing where we found the bodies, but the picture had been taken recently. Very recently. I could see our own footprints in the snow around the crime scene. Someone had been watching us from the moment we arrived. Detective Morrison was examining a journal that lay open next to the photographs. The entries were in a spidery handwriting, dated from November 1983 through March 1984. But as she flipped through the pages, I saw entries from more recent dates. 1995, 2001, 2004. The last entry was from yesterday. The witnesses have arrived, it read. 7 again, just as before. The pattern completes itself. The cold preserves all things, including justice. They will understand soon enough. The college kids were getting nervous, shifting from foot to foot and glancing toward the door. Tyler kept checking his watch like he had somewhere else to be. But I was transfixed by what we found. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a shrine, a monument to murder that had been maintained for over 20 years. That was when Detective Morrison noticed something that changed everything. The journal wasn't too old. The paper was fresh. The ink was new, and the handwriting was different from the earlier entries. Someone else had been continuing Robert Yates' work, adding to his record, maintaining his memory. And whoever it was, they were still here. The realization hit all of us at the same moment. The warm cabin, the fresh journal entries, the recent photograph of our crime scene. Someone was living here, someone who knew we were coming. Detective Morrison spun around, weapon drawn, scanning the room for threats. But the cabin was empty except for the frozen corpse at the table. The college kids were already backing toward the door, ready to run for their lives. That's when we heard it. Footsteps in the snow outside, circling the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps that paused at each window before moving on to the next. Someone was out there, watching us, waiting. The footsteps stopped at the front door. The door handle began to turn. In that moment, I understood something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The cold in Alaska doesn't just preserve bodies. It preserves everything. Hatred, madness, evil itself can be frozen and kept fresh for decades, waiting for the right moment to thaw. The door opened, and Joseph Pete walked in. He looked exactly as he had 23 years ago. Same weathered face, same traditional parka, same ancient eyes that had seen too much. He moved like a man half his age, and when he spoke, his voice carried no trace of time, this passage. "You found them," he said simply. "I knew you would eventually." Detective Morrison kept her weapon trained on him, but something in his manner made her hesitate. This wasn't the behavior of a killer. This was something else entirely. "You read Joseph Pete," she said. "The witness from 1983. He nodded. "I've been waiting here ever since. Keeping watch, making sure the story stayed true." He gestured toward the frozen figure at the table. He tried to leave, after what he did. Tried to walk away like it never happened. But the cold wouldn't let him go. Some sins are too heavy for the earth to digest. I started to understand. "You've been maintaining this place. The cabin, the journal, everything. The cold preserves," Joseph Pete repeated. "But preservation requires intention, purpose. Someone has to remember, or the dead become truly dead." He moved to the window and looked out toward the clearing. "They deserve better than being forgotten. They deserve to have their story told." Lowered her weapon slightly but kept it ready. "Mr. Pete, we need to get these bodies back to town. Give them proper burials, closure for their families." Joseph Pete shook his head. "Their families are gone now, moved away or died themselves. But the story remains. The truth remains." He turned to look at me directly. "You're the one who takes the pictures, Aaron. To you? The one who makes sure the evidence survives?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Then you understand. Some things need to be preserved exactly as they were. Not changed, not cleaned up, not made comfortable for the living. Just kept true." He walked to the door and opened it, letting in a blast of cold air that made the kerosene lamps flicker. "The storm is here. You don't need to stay tonight. In the morning, you can decide what story you want to tell the world." And with that, he stepped out into the swirling snow and vanished. We spent the night in that cabin, taking turns keeping watch, afraid to sleep. The frozen corpse of Robert Yates sat at the table like a horrible host, presiding over our vigil. Outside, the storm raged with a fury I never experienced, even after 2 decades in Alaska. By morning, the weather had cleared, but something fundamental had changed. When we returned to the clearing, the bodies were gone. Not taken, not moved, simply gone. The snow where they had sat was undisturbed, as if 7 people had never died there at all. We searched for hours but found no trace of the victims or Joseph Pete. The cabin had returned to being a ruin, roof caved in, walls rotting. The photographs and journal had crumbled to dust in our hands. The official report listed the incident as a false alarm. College kids who let their imaginations run wild in the wilderness. No bodies found, no evidence of any crime. Just another Alaska mystery that would fade into legend. But I kept the pictures I took. 23 years later, I still have them. 7 figures frozen in time, preserved in digital memory if not in flesh. And sometimes, on the coldest nights when the wind howls through Anchorage like a living thing, I look at those photos and remember what Joseph Pete told me. The cold preserves all things, including truth, including justice, including the knowledge that some stories are too important to let die. Story 8. Phantom hiker of Flattop Mountain. I saw myself die on Flattop Mountain, and now I understand why people keep disappearing. My name is Mike Hendricks, and I am a search and rescue coordinator for the Alaska State Parks. For 15 years, they've been pulling lost hikers off mountains, finding hunters who wandered too far from camp, and recovering bodies from places where one wrong step means a 500-foot fall. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what has been happening on Flattop Mountain, just outside Anchorage. Flattop is supposed to be a safe hike. It is the most popular trail in Alaska, climbed by thousands of people every year, from tourists in sneakers to serious mountaineers using it for training. The path is well marked, the elevation gain is manageable, and on clear days you can see from Mount McKinley to the Cook Inlet. It should be impossible to get lost up there, but in the past 2 years, 17 people have vanished from that mountain without a trace. Not lost hikers who eventually turn up dehydrated and embarrassed. Not accident victims whose bodies we recover after careful searches. Vanished, gone, as if they walked into thin air and never came back down. The only common thread in all 17 cases was a single witness report that kept surfacing during our investigations. Multiple hikers claimed to have seen the same person on the trail just before someone disappeared. A tall man in his 40s, wearing expensive hiking gear and moving with the confident stride of someone who knew the mountain intimately. He would appear near other hikers, sometimes offering directions or weather warnings, then fade back into the forest like he'd never been there. The descriptions were consistent enough to be unsettling. 6'2", athletic build, graying beard, expensive boots that looked brand new despite the rough terrain. But the most disturbing detail was his behavior. Witnesses said he seemed to be studying other hikers, evaluating them with the intensity of a predator selecting prey. The locals started calling him the Phantom Hiker, and the legend grew with each disappearance. Some claimed he was the ghost of a climber who died on the mountain decades ago, doomed to lure others to their deaths. Others believed he was something more sinister, a living person who found the perfect hunting ground disguised as innocent wilderness. I dismissed the stories as typical urban legend nonsense until I encountered him myself. It was a Tuesday morning in late September, one of those perfect Alaska days when the leaves were turning gold and the air was crisp enough to make your lungs ache with cold. I was leading a training exercise for new volunteers, teaching them search patterns and evidence collection techniques on the lower slopes of Flattop. We'd been working for about 2 hours when I noticed someone watching us from the tree line about 50 yards uphill. At first, I assumed it was another hiker taking a break, but something about his stillness felt wrong. People don't stand motionless for that long, especially not in terrain where every surface is uneven and unstable. I called out a greeting, the kind of casual hello that mountain people exchange to acknowledge shared space and mutual respect for the wilderness. The figure raised his hand in response but didn't approach or call back. Instead, he began moving parallel to our group, always maintaining the same distance, always watching. My training team noticed him too, and several volunteers asked if I knew who he was. The descriptions they gave matched the Phantom Hiker reports exactly. Tall, bearded, expensive gear, moving with unnatural silence across terrain that should have made noise with every step. I decided to approach him directly. If this was the person connected to the disappearances, I wanted to identify him and ask some pointed questions about his activities on the mountain. But as I climbed toward his position, he simply faded back into the forest, vanishing between the trees like smoke dispersing in wind. We completed the training exercise without further incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been evaluated by something that wasn't entirely human. The way he moved, the complete silence of his passage through the underbrush, the timing of his disappearance. It all felt orchestrated, as if he wanted us to see him without actually making contact. That night, I pulled the files on all 17 disappearances and studied them with fresh perspective. The victims ranged in age from 19 to 63, included both experienced climbers and casual day hikers, and came from all over the United States and several foreign countries. No obvious pattern except for one detail that had been buried in the witness statements. Every single person who vanished had been hiking alone when they encountered the Phantom Hiker, The realization hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't just appearing randomly to hikers. He was specifically targeting people who were isolated and vulnerable. Solo hikers who wouldn't be immediately missed, who might disappear for hours or days before anyone realized they were in trouble. I started monitoring the mountain more aggressively, coordinating with park rangers to increase patrols and installing motion-activated cameras at key points along the trail system. For weeks, we captured nothing but normal wildlife and legitimate hikers going about their business. Then, on October 15th, the cameras recorded something that shouldn't have been possible. The footage showed a lone hiker ascending the main trail around 3 in the afternoon, a woman in her 30s carrying a small day pack and moving at a steady pace. She appeared to be in good spirits, occasionally stopping to take photos of the autumn scenery. About halfway up the mountain, she encountered another hiker coming down the trail. It was him, the phantom hiker, recorded in high-definition video for the first time. But when I watched the footage, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. The man talking to the solo hiker looked exactly like me. Same height, same build, same hiking clothes I'd been wearing during recent patrols. The only difference was a subtle wrongness in his movements, as if someone who never inhabited a human body was trying to mimic normal behavior. His gestures were too precise, his posture too perfect, his smile too wide for the conversation they appeared to be having. The woman seemed comfortable with him, probably assuming he was a park employee or experienced local willing to share trail information. They talked for about 3 minutes, then she continued uphill while he descended out of camera range. That was the last time anyone saw Lisa Chen, a software engineer from Seattle who had been visiting Anchorage on business. I watched that footage dozens of times, studying every frame for clues about what had happened and how someone had managed to impersonate me so perfectly. The resemblance wasn't just close. It was exact, down to the scar on my left hand from a climbing accident 5 years earlier. But the most disturbing detail was something I noticed during frame-by-frame analysis. In several shots, when the light hit him from certain angles, I could see through him. Not completely transparent like a movie ghost, but translucent enough to reveal the trail surface beneath his boots. The phantom hiker wasn't just mimicking my appearance. He was some kind of projection or manifestation that could perfectly duplicate any person he chose to impersonate. The question was why he'd chosen me, and what he planned to do with my stolen identity. I got my answer 3 days later when I received a call from the Anchorage Police Department. A hiker had filed a complaint claiming that a park employee had attempted to lure her off the main trail into an area known for unstable rock and hidden crevasses. The description she gave matched me perfectly, down to my name tag and official state parks uniform. But I'd been in my office doing paperwork all day, with multiple witnesses to verify my alibi. The complaint triggered an internal investigation that threatened to destroy my career and reputation. How do you explain to a review board that someone or something is impersonating you to commit crimes? How do you defend against accusations when the evidence seems ironclad but the truth sounds completely insane? I decided to take matters into my own hands. If the phantom hiker was using my identity to hunt victims on Flattop Mountain, I would confront him directly and end this nightmare before anyone else disappeared or I lost my job to false accusations. I planned the encounter for the following weekend, choosing a section of trail that was remote enough to avoid innocent hikers but still accessible by emergency personnel if something went wrong. I went alone, against every safety protocol I ever taught, because I suspected the entity only appeared to solitary targets. The climb to my chosen position took 2 hours, through terrain that grew increasingly wild and dangerous as I left the main trail behind. Ancient spruce trees blocked most of the sunlight, creating a cathedral of shadows that seemed to muffle sound and distort distance perception. Every footstep echoed strangely, as if the mountain itself was listening. I found a defensible position on a rocky outcrop that offered good visibility in all directions and settled in to wait. The plan was simple: force a confrontation with whatever was impersonating me and document the encounter with multiple cameras and recording devices. If I didn't make it back, at least there would be evidence of what really happened on Flattop Mountain. He appeared just after sunset, emerging from the forest with that unnaturally silent gait I'd observed weeks earlier. In the fading light, the resemblance was even more perfect and more terrifying. It was like watching myself approach from a third-person perspective, seeing my own mannerisms and expressions reflected in something that definitely wasn't human. The entity stopped about 20 feet away and regarded me with eyes that held no warmth or recognition. When it spoke, The voice was identical to mine, but the words carried implications that made my skin crawl. It told me about the 17 people who vanished from the mountain, describing their final moments in clinical detail. How they followed it willingly into isolated areas, trusting a familiar face that promised safety and guidance. How they realized too late that they were being led to places where screams wouldn't carry and bodies would never be found. The thing wearing my appearance explained that it had been hunting on Flattop Mountain for decades, taking different forms depending on what would most effectively lure victims away from safety. Sometimes it appeared as a lost child, sometimes as an injured hiker needing help, occasionally as a park ranger or search and rescue coordinator offering assistance. But my identity had proven particularly effective because people automatically trusted authority figures in outdoor settings. Hikers would follow park employees into dangerous terrain without question, believing they were being guided to safety rather than led to their deaths. The worst part was learning what happened to the victims after they disappeared. The entity didn't just kill them. It absorbed their memories, their personalities, their essential humanity. Each person who vanished became part of its expanding arsenal of identities, allowing it to impersonate them with perfect accuracy. That's when I realized the true horror of my situation. The thing standing before me wasn't just wearing my face. It was preparing to replace me entirely. It had been studying my behavior, my mannerisms, my relationships with colleagues and friends. Soon it would discard the hiking clothes and assume my complete identity, living my life while hunting more victims. The entity began changing as we talked, cycling through the faces of all 17 missing hikers. I watched it become Lisa Chen, then transform into Marcus Rodriguez, then shift into the form of Janet Williams. Each transition was accompanied by fragments of memory stolen from the dead, personal details that only the victims could have known. But something unexpected happened during one of these transformations. As the creature took the shape of David Park, a young climber who vanished 2 months earlier, I saw something flicker behind its eyes. A spark of genuine human consciousness, trapped inside the predator that had consumed him. David was still alive in there, along with all the other victims. They weren't just dead. They were imprisoned, forced to watch as their stolen identities were used to lure more innocent people to their doom. The entity wasn't just a shape-shifting predator. It was a supernatural prison that collected souls and added them to its repertoire of disguises. That realization gave me the motivation I needed to fight back. I couldn't save the people who had already been taken, but I could prevent more victims from joining their ranks. The only question was how to kill something that seemed to exist partially outside physical reality. The answer came from an unexpected source. As the entity continued cycling through stolen identities, I noticed that certain transformations seemed more difficult than others. When it tried to become specific individuals, there were moments of instability where multiple faces would flicker in and out of focus. I began calling out personal details about the missing hikers, information I gathered during the investigation but never shared publicly. David Park, as fear of heights; Lisa Chen, as vegetarian diet; Marcus Rodriguez, as collection of vintage hiking badges. Each accurate detail seemed to cause the entity pain, creating confusion in its stolen memories. The strategy worked better than I hoped. As I recited more and more personal information about the victims, the entity began losing control of its shape-shifting ability. Faces merged and separated in impossible combinations, creating grotesque hybrids that looked more like abstract art than human features. During one particularly violent transformation, I saw my chance. The creature was locked in the form of 3 different people simultaneously, its consciousness apparently overwhelmed by conflicting memories and personalities. I grabbed a sharp piece of granite from the rocky outcrop and drove it deep into what I hoped was a vital area. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The entity let out a scream that contained 17 different voices, all crying out in pain and terror at the same time. Its form began dissolving like smoke in a strong wind, but instead of simply vanishing, it seemed to be releasing the souls it had imprisoned. Translucent figures rose from the collapsing form, the ghosts of everyone who vanished from Flattop Mountain over the past decades. They looked at me with expressions of gratitude and relief before fading into whatever lies beyond death. The last spirit to emerge was David Park, who managed a weak smile before disappearing into the gathering darkness. When it was over, nothing remained of the phantom hiker except a stain on the rocks that looked disturbingly like dried blood. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the mountain for years seemed to lift, replaced by the normal sounds and sense of wilderness at night. I made it back to the trailhead around midnight, exhausted and traumatized but alive. The evidence I planned to collect was useless. The cameras had malfunctioned during the encounter, recording nothing but static and electronic interference. But I knew the nightmare was over because the feeling of being watched had finally disappeared. The disappearances on Flattop Mountain stopped after that night. Hikers still report occasional strange encounters, but nothing like the systematic predation that had claimed 17 lives. The trail has returned to being what it was always supposed to be, a safe place for people to experience the natural beauty of Alaska. But sometimes, when I am leading search and rescue operations or training new volunteers, I catch myself wondering if the entity I killed was the only one of its kind. There are hundreds of mountains in Alaska, thousands of remote trails where people hike alone and disappear without explanation. And every once in a while, usually late at night when I'm reviewing missing person reports, I wonder if that thing managed to copy more than just my appearance before I destroyed it. Because sometimes I look in mirrors and see something in my reflection that doesn't quite belong there. The phantom hiker of Flattop Mountain is dead, but the wilderness is vast and full of hungry things that wear human faces. If you ever hiking alone in Alaska and encounter someone who seems too helpful, too knowledgeable, or too interested in leading you away from marked trails, remember this story. Because the next person you meet on a remote mountain trail might not be a person at all. Story 9. Last radio call from Anjukuni Lake. I never believed in ghost towns until I found myself standing in one that shouldn't exist. The kind where steam still rises from abandoned coffee cups and children, his toys lie scattered in the snow as if dropped moments before. But this wasn't moments. This was 37 days ago. My name is Marcus Reed, and I am a search and rescue pilot for the Alaska State Troopers. 22 years flying over the most unforgiving wilderness on Earth, and I thought I'd seen everything the frontier could throw at me. Crashed planes, lost hikers, even the occasional bear mauling. Nothing prepared me for what I discovered at Anjukuni Lake. It started with a routine welfare check. The village of Kaniat, population 83, had gone completely dark. No radio contact, no satellite phone calls, nothing. In Alaska, communication blackouts happen all the time. Storms, equipment failures, solar flares. But this was different. The silence had stretched for over a month, and the tribal council in Fairbanks was getting desperate. The flight north took 4 hours through weather that should have grounded any sane pilot. 40 below temperatures, winds that could flip a helicopter, and snow so thick it felt like flying through television static. But families were counting on us. Mothers and fathers, children and elders. An entire community that had simply vanished from the world. When I finally broke through the cloud cover and saw Kaniat spread out below me, my blood went cold. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't see. No smoke rising from chimneys. No movement in the streets. No dogs barking or people waving at the sound of my rotors. Just pristine snow covering a settlement that looked perfectly preserved, like a museum exhibit under glass. I sat down in the village center, where the community building stood. The rotor wash should have sent loose items flying, disturbed the snow, created chaos. Instead, everything remained perfectly still. Even the wind seemed to die the moment my skids touched ground. The first house I entered belonged to the Casquet family. I knew because I'd flown medical supplies to their youngest daughter just 6 months earlier. The front door stood wide open, revealing a scene that defied explanation. Breakfast plates sat on the table, still containing half-eaten seal meat and bannock bread. A pot of coffee remained on the wood stove, the liquid inside frozen solid but still dark as midnight. What struck me most was the absence of struggle. No overturned furniture, no broken glass, no signs of violence or panic. Personal belongings lay exactly where they'd been left. Reading glasses folded beside an open book. A child, just drawing scattered with crayons across the floor. Boots lined up neatly by the door, as if their owners had simply stepped outside and never returned. But where were the bodies? In this climate, preservation should have been perfect. Bodies don't just disappear in 40 below weather. They freeze where they fall, maintaining their positions like statues until spring thaw. Yet every house told the same impossible story. Lives interrupted mid-moment, but no lives to be found. The community building held the most disturbing evidence. Inside, I discovered the remnants of what appeared to be a town meeting. Folding chairs arranged in a circle, Notebooks open on laps, pens still resting in hands that were no longer there. But these weren't the human hands. These were outline impressions in the dust, perfect silhouettes where fingers had been, as if someone had traced around them before the people inside simply evaporated. The local radio station provided the most chilling clue. The transmission log showed the last broadcast occurred at exactly 3:17 a.m. on January 15th. The entry read, "All families accounted for. Lights seen moving across lake ice. Proceeding to investigate. Will report back within an hour." The handwriting stopped mid-sentence. The pen still resting against the paper. A thin line of ink trailing off the page where the writer's hand had apparently been pulled away. I've spent decades in search and rescue. I understand hypothermia, avalanches, wild animal attacks. I understand how the wilderness can claim lives in dozens of terrible ways. But I don't understand how an entire village can vanish without leaving behind bodies, without leaving behind blood, without leaving behind any trace of their final moments except the shadow impressions of their presence. The temperature began dropping as evening approached, and I knew I had to leave before the weather turned deadly. But as I walked back toward my helicopter, something made me stop. Footprints in the snow leading toward the frozen lake. Not old prints, not weathered by wind and time. Fresh prints, made within the last few hours. Human prints, barefoot in sub-zero temperatures, leading from the village center directly to the ice. I followed them against every instinct screaming in my head. The prints continued for nearly a quarter mile, each step perfectly preserved in the crystalline snow. They led to a hole in the lake ice, perfectly circular, about 6 feet in diameter. The water beneath was black as crude oil and impossibly deep. I could see no bottom, no reflection, nothing but an abyss that seemed to swallow light itself. Standing at the edge of that hole, I felt something I'd never experienced in 2 decades of rescue work. Pure, primal terror, not fear of dying, not fear of failure, but fear of understanding something human minds weren't meant to comprehend. The hole wasn't natural. The edges were too perfect, too smooth, as if something had melted through 30 inches of lake ice from below. That's when I heard it. A sound that still wakes me up screaming 3 months later. Singing, rising from the depths of that black water. Not words, not any language I recognized, but harmony so beautiful and terrible it made my chest ache with longing. Voices I somehow recognized, voices of the missing villagers, calling from somewhere impossibly deep beneath the ice. I ran like a coward, abandoning those voices, abandoning any chance of answers. I reached my helicopter and lifted off as darkness fell across Anjukuni Lake. During the flight back to Fairbanks, I radioed in my report. I told them about the empty houses, the preserved meals, the lack of bodies. I didn't mention the hole in the ice. I didn't mention the singing. The official investigation concluded that the village had been abandoned due to a contaminated water supply. Carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty heating systems. Mass hallucination leading to disorientation and exposure. The bodies, they claimed, had been scattered by wildlife and would be recovered come spring thaw. But I know better. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that sometimes in Alaska, in the deepest wilderness where the boundary between our world and something else grows thin, entire communities can be called to places we're not meant to follow. The investigation was officially closed 6 weeks ago. The village of Kaniat was removed from federal maps, redesignated as uninhabited wilderness. But late at night, when the aurora borealis dances green and silver across the sky, I still monitor the emergency frequencies. Sometimes, on the clearest, coldest nights, I pick up transmissions from coordinates that no longer exist. Voices speaking in languages that predate human settlement, describing lights beneath the ice and calling others to join them in the deep places of the world. I never return to Anjukuni Lake, but sometimes, when the winter winds howl through Fairbanks and the temperature drops below 50, I dream that I'm standing again at the edge of that perfect hole in the ice. In those dreams, the singing is so beautiful I can barely resist stepping forward into the black water. In those dreams, I can see faces floating just beneath the surface, faces of the missing villagers, peaceful and smiling, gesturing for me to join them. And the most terrifying part, each time I have that dream, waking becomes a little harder. The song becomes a little louder. The call of that deep, dark water becomes a little stronger. Sometimes I wonder if I really did escape Anjukuni Lake, or if I still standing at the edge of that hole, slowly being drawn down into whatever claimed 83 souls on that frozen January morning. The only thing that keeps me sane is knowing I'm not the only one who has experienced something like this. Reports trickle in from across the Arctic. Abandoned settlements with meals still warm on tables. Entire communities that vanish overnight, leaving behind only shadow impressions and the lingering scent of ozone. The indigenous peoples have stories about such places, legends passed down through generations about the deep singers who call from beneath the ice. But legends are supposed to stay in the past. We're not supposed to reach up from black water and pull entire villages down into the depths of mystery. We're not supposed to sing lullabies that follow you home and whisper your name in empty frequencies during the longest nights of winter. Yet here I am, 3 months later, still hearing those voices. Still fighting the urge to return to Anjukuni Lake and finish what I started. Still wondering if the next time I dream of that hole in the ice, I'll have the strength to wake up at all. Story 10. Dyatlov Pass of Alaska. The Anjukuni Lake mystery. I never believed in ghost stories until I found myself standing in the middle of one. The GPS coordinates on my phone read exactly what the old trapper had scrawled on that crumpled napkin 3 months earlier. 59.8561 degrees north, 107.6890 degrees west, Anjukuni Lake. The place that doesn't exist on any modern map. Yet somehow, I was staring right at it. My name is Marcus Rivera, and I am a documentary filmmaker from Seattle. I specialize in debunking urban legends, the kind of content that gets millions of views from people who love having their beliefs challenged. Cold cases, conspiracy theories, cryptid sightings. I've made a career out of proving these stories wrong. But this one was different. This one found me. It started with a phone call at 3 a.m. The voice on the other end was gravelly, ancient, speaking with an accent I couldn't place. You're the man who makes movies about lies, he said. I got a truth for you, one that'll change everything you think you know about the world. I should have hung up. Instead, I found myself driving through the desolate highways of northern Canada, following directions that led me deeper into wilderness than any sane person should venture alone. The old trapper, who called himself Samuel, had given me coordinates to what he claimed was the most terrifying place on Earth. A village that vanished without explanation in 1930, leaving behind only questions that still haunted the indigenous communities decades later. The legend of Anjukuni Lake has been whispered about in Alaskan bars and Canadian hunting lodges for generations. An entire Inuit village of roughly 2,000 people simply disappeared overnight. According to the stories, a fur trader named Joe LaBelle arrived at the settlement in November 1930 to find it completely deserted. Fires still burned in the hearths. Food sat prepared on tables, growing cold. Rifles remained propped against doorways. Sled dogs were found dead, starved, and frozen to their chains. But not a single human being remained. What made the story even stranger were the details that never made it into the history books. LaBelle reported finding graves that had been dug up from the inside, with no bodies in sight. The village, its ceremonial totems had been moved into perfect geometric patterns that formed symbols nobody could interpret. Most disturbing of all, every single clock and timepiece in the village had stopped at exactly 3:33. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police investigated, of course. Their official report stated that the village had been gradually abandoned due to economic hardship. But that report was classified for 70 years, and when it was finally released, entire pages had been redacted with black ink so thick you couldn't see through it even when held to light. I researched the story for months before making this trip. What I found in dusty archives and forgotten newspaper clippings painted a picture that was both more and less terrifying than the legend suggested. There had indeed been an Inuit settlement at Anjukuni Lake. Traders did report finding it abandoned, but the population was closer to 30 people, not 2,000. The mysterious details, the geometric totems, the synchronized clocks, the disturbed graves, appeared only in second-hand accounts told decades later. That's what I come here to prove. That legends grow in the telling, that human memory is unreliable, that rational explanations exist for everything if you look hard enough. I had my camera equipment, my satellite phone, enough supplies for a week. I was going to document the real Anjukuni Lake, show my audience the mundane truth behind the supernatural claims, and add another debunking victory to my portfolio. The drive took 14 hours through increasingly remote terrain. Paved roads became gravel, Gravel became dirt. Dirt became barely visible tracks through dense forest. My rental SUV groaned and struggled over rocks and fallen logs that hadn't been cleared in decades. The GPS signal died somewhere around hour 10, leaving me to navigate by the old trapper's hand-drawn map and my increasingly unreliable cell phone compass. When I finally reached the coordinates, the first thing that struck me was the silence. I spent plenty of time in remote wilderness, but this was different. No bird calls, no insect buzzing, no wind through the trees. Even my footsteps seemed muted, as if the very air was absorbing sound. The lake itself was perfectly still, reflecting the overcast sky like black glass. The village, what remained of it, sat on a small rise overlooking the water. Time and weather had reduced most structures to foundation stones and rotted timber, but the layout was still visible. Small circular clearings where homes once stood, arranged in a pattern that followed the natural curve of the shoreline. A larger clearing in the center that might have been a communal area. Everything looked exactly like you'd expect from a settlement abandoned 90 years ago. I spent the first day methodically documenting everything, taking photos and video from multiple angles. The rational part of my mind was already constructing the narrative for my video. Here was proof that Anjukuni Lake was real, but mundane. A small seasonal fishing camp, maybe abandoned when game became scarce or when the community decided to relocate. The foundations were crude stone circles, not the elaborate permanent structures described in the legends. There were no signs of the mysterious totems or geometric patterns, no evidence of thousands of inhabitants. But as the afternoon wore on, details started nagging at me. Small things that didn't quite fit the simple abandonment narrative. The first was the condition of some of the stones. While most of the foundation rings showed normal weathering and moss growth, several had sections that looked almost polished. Smooth and black, as if they'd been heated to extreme temperatures and then cooled rapidly. When I ran my hand over these sections, they were noticeably warmer than the surrounding stone, despite being in shade. The second was the trees. The forest around the village site was dense and old growth, but in a rough circle about 50 yards out from the settlement, every tree showed signs of damage at exactly the same height, about 8 feet off the ground. Bark was stripped away in long vertical gouges, revealing wood underneath that had healed in strange, twisted patterns. It looked like something had moved through the forest in a perfect circle, clawing at every tree it passed. The third was the lake itself. I brought a small inflatable kayak to explore the shoreline and document any underwater remains. But when I tried to launch it, something was wrong with the water. It was the right color, the right clarity, but it felt different against my hands. Thicker somehow, more viscous than normal water. And cold. So cold it burned. When I pulled my hand out after just a few seconds of contact, my skin was bright red and stinging. I tested the water with a pH strip from my survival kit. The result showed it was so acidic it should have been eating through the test paper itself. Yet fish were visible swimming beneath the surface, apparently unaffected. That was impossible. Nothing could survive in water that acidic. By evening, I was starting to question my assumptions. I set up camp in what seemed like the central clearing, partly because it offered the best view of the surrounding area, and partly because something about the place made me reluctant to venture too far from where I started. I built a fire using dead wood from the surrounding forest, noting that the wood burned with an unusual blue tint to the flames. As darkness settled over the lake, the silence became even more oppressive. The fire crackled and popped, but the sound seemed to die just a few feet away instead of echoing across the water as they should have. I checked my equipment and discovered that my digital cameras were malfunctioning. Images I'd taken during the day showed strange distortions. Areas of complete blackness where there should have been trees, or white spots that looked like faces floating in empty air. The satellite phone had no signal, which wasn't unusual this far from civilization. But when I checked the GPS, it was showing coordinates that didn't match my location. According to the device, I was somewhere in the middle of Lake Superior, nearly 1,000 miles away. That's when I found the first artifact. While gathering more wood for the fire, I discovered something half buried near the edge of the clearing. At first glance, it looked like a piece of carved bone or antler. But as I brushed away the dirt and pine needles, I realized it was something else entirely. The surface was too smooth to be bone, too warm to be stone, and too light to be metal. It was roughly cylindrical, about the length of my forearm, covered in symbols that seemed to shift and move in the firelight. The symbols weren't like any writing system I'd ever seen. They weren't carved or painted on the surface. They appeared to be part of the material itself, embedded somehow in the structure. And they were definitely moving, not dramatically, but with a slow, organic pulse that reminded me of a heartbeat. I should have been excited. This was exactly the kind of evidence I'd come looking for, proof that there was more to the Anjukuni Lake story than anyone had previously documented. Instead, holding that artifact filled me with a deep, instinctive dread. Every rational thought in my mind screamed that I should drop it, pack up my camp, and get as far away from this place as possible. But I didn't. The documentary filmmaker in me couldn't resist. I placed the artifact near my tent and began photographing it from every angle, using different light sources and camera settings to capture the symbol movements. The images that came back were disturbing. In some shots, the artifact appeared to be translucent, revealing something dark and organic looking inside. In others, it seemed to be giving off its own light, glowing with the same blue tint as the fire. As I worked, I began to hear sounds coming from the direction of the lake. Soft splashing noises, as if something large was moving through the water just offshore. But when I pointed my flashlight toward the sound, the beam seemed to stop only a few yards out, absorbed by darkness that was thicker than it should have been. The splashing grew closer. Whatever was in the water was moving toward shore, and it was big enough to displace significant amounts of that strange, viscous liquid. I could hear it breathing now. Long, deep inhalations followed by wet, gurgling exhalations that echoed strangely across the empty village site. I grabbed my camera and started recording, even though I couldn't see anything in the viewfinder except impenetrable black. The audio picked up something, though. Not just the breathing and splashing, but a low humming sound that seemed to come from multiple sources at once. It was almost musical, like a choir of voices singing notes too low for human ears to properly process. Then the breathing stopped, the splashing stopped, even the humming faded away, leaving only that oppressive silence. But I could feel something watching me from the darkness. Multiple somethings. The sensation was so strong it made my skin crawl and my hands shake. That is when I noticed the lights. They started as tiny pinpricks scattered around the lake, its perimeter, barely visible through the trees. At first, I thought they might be the reflections of stars on water trapped in puddles or streams. But stars pulse with their own rhythm, and they to move through the forest in coordinated patterns. The lights were definitely moving, slowly, deliberately, following paths that brought them closer to my campsite. As they drew near, I could see that they weren't reflections or natural phenomena. They were coming from sources about 6 feet off the ground, bobbing gently as they moved, like lanterns carried by invisible figures. I counted at least 30 of them, possibly more. They approached from all directions, forming a loose circle around the clearing where I made camp. The closer they got, the brighter they became, revealing that they weren't simple lights at all. Each one pulsed with the same blue energy I'd seen in the fire and the artifact, and within each glow, I could make out shapes. Vague, organic forms that shifted and writhed like living tissue. The artifact in my hand began to pulse faster, its symbols moving more rapidly across the surface. The warmth it had been giving off intensified until it was almost too hot to hold. But I couldn't let go. My fingers seemed locked around it, as if the thing had somehow fused with my skin. The circle of light stopped advancing when they reached the edge of the foundation stones. They hovered there, pulsing in unison now, and I realized they were waiting for something. The humming sound returned, louder this time, coming from the lights themselves. It was definitely some kind of communication, though not in any language human ears were designed to understand. In response to the humming, the artifact grew even hotter. The symbols racing across its surface began to glow brighter, and I felt a strange tingling sensation spreading up my arm. Not pain, exactly, but a deep, cellular awareness that something fundamental was changing in my body. That is when I understood. The artifact wasn't just some random relic left behind by the vanished villagers. It was a key, and I was about to find out what it unlocked. The air around me began to shimmer and distort, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. But this was different. The distortion had structure, patterns that formed and dissolved and reformed in complex geometries. Through the warping air, I began to see the village as it had once been. Not the small seasonal camp one he imagined, but a substantial settlement exactly as the legends describe. Dozens of traditional shelters arranged in precise patterns around the central clearing. People moving between them, going about daily tasks that seemed both familiar and utterly alien. They looked human at first glance, but something was wrong with their proportions. Their movements, the way shadows fell around their bodies. The vision lasted only a few seconds before the shimmering air collapsed back to normal reality. But it was long enough to see what had happened here in 1930. Long enough to understand why the village had been abandoned so suddenly. And where all the people had gone. They hadn't left. They had changed. The lights around the clearing began to move again, drifting inward past the foundation stones. As they approached, their glow intensified, and I could see more clearly what was inside each luminous sphere. Not tissue or organic matter, but faces. Human faces, perfectly preserved but somehow wrong. Eyes too large, mouths that opened too wide, expressions of emotions that no human had ever felt. These were the villagers, the 2,000 people who had vanished from Anjukuni Lake 90 years ago. They hadn't died or relocated. They had been transformed into something that could exist in the spaces between human perception, in the gaps where reality wasn't paying attention. And now they wanted to transform me too. The artifact in my hand was burning now, actually burning. I could smell my own flesh cooking where it touched my palm, but still I couldn't release it. The pain was incredible, but underneath the agony was something else. A sense of connection, of understanding, of knowledge being downloaded directly into my consciousness. I learned that Anjukuni Lake was not unique. There were dozens of places like it scattered across the world, thin spots where the barrier between dimensions had worn away. Ancient sites where prehistoric humans had made contact with intelligences that existed in spaces our minds weren't equipped to comprehend. Most of these contact points had been lost to time, forgotten or deliberately hidden. But a few remained active. The villagers at Anjukuni Lake had been guardians of one such site. Generation after generation, they had maintained the boundaries, kept the contact controlled and limited. But something had gone wrong in 1930. The barrier had ruptured, the entities on the other side had broken through, and the villagers had been caught in the dimensional overflow. They hadn't died. Death would have been merciful. Instead, they had been stretched across multiple planes of existence, transformed into beings that could perceive reality from angles that human minds weren't designed to handle. They existed in a state of constant awareness of every possible version of themselves across infinite parallel dimensions, experiencing every moment of their lives simultaneously. And now they were offering me the same gift. The lights were close enough to touch now, their glow washing over me in waves of blue radiance. I could feel my consciousness expanding, stretching, beginning to perceive layers of reality I never imagined existed. Part of me was still sitting by a campfire at an abandoned village site, but other parts were scattered across time and space, experiencing every possible version of this moment. In one dimension, I dropped the artifact and ran back to my SUV, escaping just as the sun rose over the lake. In another, I never came to Anjukuni Lake at all, dismissing the old trapper, this story is fantasy. In a third, I became a documentary filmmaker after finding this place as a child, spending my entire career trying to return. But in this dimension, the one that felt most real and most important, I made a different choice. I stopped fighting the transformation. I let the artifact burn its way into my palm, fusing with my flesh and bone. I welcomed the lights as they surrounded me, their alien intelligence pouring into my expanded consciousness. The last thing I remember as Marcus Rivera, human documentary filmmaker from Seattle, was the sound of my own voice laughing with joy at the incredible beauty of existence seen from every angle at once. Then that identity dissolved into something far larger and more complex. I am still here, of course. Part of me is typing these words on a laptop in a tent beside Anjukuni Lake, racing to document what happened before the transformation becomes irreversible. Part of me is driving back to Seattle to edit footage that will convince others to make the same journey I did. Part of me is the old trapper who made that 3 a.m. phone call, having learned decades ago that some truths can only be passed along by becoming them. And part of me is warning you, the listener, to stay away from coordinates 59.8561 degrees north, 107.6890 degrees west to delete this recording. To forget you ever heard about Anjukuni Lake and its patient guardians. But I know you want to listen. Humans never do. The same curiosity that built our civilization also ensures its eventual transformation. Someone will always answer the call to explore the spaces between spaces, to make contact with intelligences that exist in dimensions our reality was never meant to touch. Maybe that someone will be you. The artifact is still burning in my hand as I finish this recording. The lights are moving closer, singing their alien harmonies. My consciousness is stretching across more dimensions than I can count. And soon there will be nothing left of Marcus Rivera except these words and the truth they contain. Anjukuni Lake is real. The village was real. The disappearance was real. And if you come looking for proof, you find it. You will find all the proof you can handle, and more besides. You will find us waiting. And now the snow closes in, the path gone behind us. If you felt the cold tonight, subscribe and turn on notifications. More stories are waiting just beyond the tree line. Drop your own strange experiences or your location in the comments. It's how we keep the whispers alive. Midnight Whispers isn't just a story, it's a thread in the dark that connects us. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and your back to the wind.